My name is Randall, and I'm 58 years old. For the last 18 months of my life, I let my two oldest children believe I was a lost cause, a widower drifting through his days, too stunned by grief to know which end was up. They called it concern. They held that word carefully, like something borrowed and planned to return. And at the reading of my will, when my solicitor picked up the sealed envelope and said there was one more document to be heard, my oldest son Smirked died so fast it pulled the air out of the room with it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it started. A cold Friday afternoon in February, when we buried Anita in the churchyard 2 blocks from the house where we'd spent 31 years of marriage. The reception was at our place. I'd painted the living room sage green the summer before, Anita's pick. People came through in their winter coats with casseroles and platitudes, and I moved through all of it like I was standing at the wrong end of a long hallway. Couldn't quite reach any of it. My oldest found me in the mudroom. He's 39, works in real estate, always has the look of a man calculating something just behind his eyes. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Dad, once things settle a bit, we should sit down and talk about the property." Anita had been in the ground less than 6 hours. "The property," I said. "Just getting ahead of things. You shouldn't have to manage all this alone." It felt like a handshake after a car accident. Too firm, too practiced. My daughter drifted over from the kitchen. She's 36, sharp in ways that don't always serve her well. "He's right," she said quietly. "We should think about next steps. Power of attorney, maybe. Just to keep things organized." Power of attorney. Anita's reading glasses were still on the nightstand upstairs. I nodded. I said nothing, but something in me shifted. Not grief, not anger, something quieter than either, an awareness. Like stepping outside and noticing it's been raining for a while. Across the room, my youngest was loading the dishwasher. He's 32, works as an educational assistant at Grenville Elementary, makes $42,000 a year, and hadn't been asked to clean a single thing. He just saw what needed doing and did it, the same as always. My oldest watched him for a moment, then looked back at me with a small, dismissive smile. He's always been good at the background stuff. I didn't answer. I just watched my youngest son stack plates in a house full of people who hadn't said a word to him all afternoon, and I understood, maybe for the first time, what I'd been too busy living to see clearly. I'd been looking at my children for decades. I hadn't always been watching. That day changed that. The calls came on a schedule, once I learned to read them. My oldest called when he needed something. There was always a deal that was almost there. Always a shortfall that just needed a bridge. "Just a short-term thing, Dad," he'd say. I'd write the check. He wouldn't call again for 3 weeks. My daughter called Sunday evenings. She'd start with small talk. How was I eating? Was I sleeping? And then somewhere around the 15-minute mark, the ask would appear. Could I lend the kids my truck? Could I co-sign on something? Could I acknowledge, just once, that she was the one who'd given up the most? I could never figure out what she'd given up. She'd moved 40 minutes away 12 years ago for a job she'd chosen, but the martyrdom was important to her, so I never pressed. Then there was my youngest. He called on Wednesdays to check in, and the calls had no agenda in them at all. He'd ask about the furnace filter, remind me when my car insurance renewed, tell me something funny a kid at his school had said that day. He never once mentioned the house, the RRSPs, the property. Not once. My oldest and my daughter had a name for him. They said it at family dinners, sometimes loud enough that they knew I could hear. The charity case. He'd taken a few too many years to finish his degree, bounced between jobs in his mid-20s before landing something that didn't pay much, but that he was quietly good at. To my oldest, that made him a failure. To my daughter, an embarrassment. What neither of them said out loud was this. When Anita's cancer came back the second time, when the chemo stripped her down to something I barely recognized, it was my youngest who drove 4 hours from Smiths Falls every other weekend to sit with her. Not because we asked. Because he showed up. The other two sent meal kit boxes from a delivery service. They piled up in the garage. I remembered that. I wrote it down. I started keeping a notepad in my workshop, not out of bitterness. I want to be honest about that. But because grief does something to your ability to trust your own memory, and I needed to see things clearly without the haze of it. So I wrote. Who called and why? The loans my oldest never mentioned again after I deposited the money. The Sundays my daughter went quiet when I had nothing to offer her. The more I wrote, the more one question kept surfacing. Why was the person who'd shown up the hardest the one they talked about with the least respect? My youngest had moved back to the area 2 years before Anita got sick the second time. Took a small apartment in Westport, didn't announce it like a sacrifice. Just said he wanted to be closer, and then he started showing up. Tuesdays he'd drive me to my cardiology appointments at the hospital in Kingston. He'd wait in the plastic chairs with a paperback, never making me feel like a man who needed to be managed. Thursdays he'd bring groceries and try to cook something Anita used to make. He got better at it gradually, which I thought she'd have appreciated. When the eavesdrops started pulling away from the roofline that first winter, the kind of thing I'd have handled without thinking, but my left shoulder wasn't cooperating anymore. My oldest promised to send someone from his crew. 2 months went by. My youngest drove up on a Saturday, stood in the cold on a borrowed ladder, and fixed it himself while I handed him tools from the garage floor and pretended I wasn't worried about him falling. You don't have to be doing all this, I told him. He climbed down and wiped his hands on his jeans. Dad, I'm not here for the house. I'd spent enough years around people to know the difference between words that cost something and words that don't. His cost something. I heard the difference. His brother and sister couldn't understand it. People who've never done a thing without calculating the return can't imagine why anyone would. They started framing it differently. Quietly at first, then less quietly. He's setting himself up, my daughter told her brother on my back porch one evening in July. She thought I was watching the game inside. The window was open. Figures if he stays close enough, long enough, Dad'll forget what he promised us. He hasn't promised them anything, my oldest said. Dad's not exactly thinking straight these days. I stood in my kitchen and let that land. They weren't just underestimating my youngest. They were building a story about him, one they planned to sell to me eventually, and I understood something that settled cold in my chest. I had to be further ahead of them than they knew. Let me tell you what there was to fight over because it matters. The house is a century-old red brick on 2.5 acres just outside of Perth. Anita and I had put almost everything we had into it over 30 years. The renovation, the new roof, the septic work, the kitchen we rebuilt ourselves. The summer the kids were teenagers. The land runs down to a small pond where I taught all 3 of them to skate in the winters when it froze hard enough. There were also the RRSPs we'd built quietly over 4 decades of doing without things we wanted, and a small defined contribution pension from my years as a licensed electrician. To me, it was 30 years of Saturdays. To my oldest, it was $800,000 on the Perth real estate market, maybe more. I heard him on the phone in my driveway one Sunday afternoon in September. He didn't know the kitchen window was cracked. The property alone is probably $750, maybe $8, he said. And you can't beat the lot size that close to town. He was pricing the ground, where Anita's flower beds were still coming up through the cold. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Then I thought about a man named Gerald Bellamy, a solicitor on Gore Street I'd used when we'd last updated our wills. Thorough, careful, the kind of man who asked the questions you hadn't thought to ask yourself. But first, I wanted to be certain. I wanted to see all of it without leaving myself room for doubt later, so I kept quiet and let them keep showing me who they were. Sunday dinner in October. All of them at my table, the pine one I'd refinished the year before Anita's diagnosis. They talked about me like I'd stepped out of the room. Dad really shouldn't be managing the financial stuff on his own anymore, my oldest said, passing the bread basket. No offense, Dad. None taken, I said. I took some. My daughter nodded, eager. We should look into getting power of attorney in place. Just as a precaution. Just as a precaution. I'd seen that phrase used to justify a lot of things that were not precautions. My daughter-in-law smiled at me from across the table, all warmth and no heat behind it. You're not getting any younger, Randall. We just want to make sure you're protected. I was 57. I'd rewired a rental property that spring with my nephew, but I smiled back and said nothing useful. My youngest sat at the far end of the table with his jaw tight, watching his plate. He caught my eye once and gave the smallest shake of his head. Don't engage, I understood. Then my daughter turned toward him. Still doing the teacher's aide thing? She said in that particular tone that manages to be polite and dismissive at the same time, the kind only family can pull off. Nobody filled the silence that followed. It had a shape to it, that silence. Comfortable for everyone except the two of us. Someone should have oversight, my daughter added, smoothing it over. Someone responsible, she meant, not my youngest. I looked around at my children, the two who wanted the estate and the one who wanted me. I nodded slowly. You might be right, I said. I let them think they'd gained something. Under the table, my hand was closed hard around my napkin. That night, I sat in my workshop for 2 hours and filled 3 pages of my notepad. And the next morning, I called Gerald Bellamy's office and made an appointment I didn't tell anyone about. Bellamy's office was up a narrow staircase above a shop on Gore Street, a room that smelled of old carpet and radiator heat. He was close to my age, wore reading glasses on a lanyard, and had the particular patience of a man who'd spent 30 years hearing family stories he'd never repeat. Randall, he said, shaking my hand. I'm sorry about Anita. Thank you. I need to change my will, all of it. He pulled out a legal pad without ceremony. Tell me what you're thinking. So I told him. About the 16 drives to Kingston. About the eavesdrew in November. About my oldest's phone call in the driveway. About my daughter's careful language at my own table. About the notepad in my workshop and the 1.5 years I'd spent watching. Bellamy listened without interrupting. When I finished, he set down his pen. You understand this can be contested, he said. The amounts involved will make that tempting. I figured. Then we do it right. Physician's letter dated the same day you sign, attesting to your full competency. 2 witnesses with no financial stake in the estate. Every clause properly executed. We leave no gaps. He leaned forward slightly. I have to ask one thing. Are you doing this from grief or from clarity? I thought about my oldest on the phone in the driveway. I thought about my youngest on that ladder in the cold. I thought about the meal kit boxes piling up in the garage. Clarity, I said. More of it than I've had in years. He almost smiled. He began to write. We worked for 2.5 hours, every clause, every name, every dollar. He suggested a separate sealed letter to be read aloud at the execution of the will. I agreed. I already knew what I needed to say. Walking out to my truck, the November air was sharp and the street was quiet. What I'd decided in that office wouldn't matter for a while yet. But when it did, it would matter all at once. That winter, 2 neighbors from the next property oversigned as witnesses. A couple who'd known Anita and me for 20 years. Good people with nothing at stake in any of it. I handed Bellamy a letter I'd spent 4 nights writing. I'd tried to keep anger out of it. I'd wanted it clear, not cruel. I wrote about the chemo drives, about who sat in the waiting room and who sent boxes in the mail. I wrote about the eavesdrew and the groceries and the Wednesday phone calls with no agenda. I wrote that I loved all 3 of my children, which was true, and that love and inheritance are not the same thing, which was also true. And I came back 1 line, every time I considered softening the rest. A person who only shows up when there's something to show up for hasn't shown up at all. Bellamy read it once, folded it, and sealed it into an envelope. He wrote across the flap in careful capitals, "To be read aloud at the will reading." Walking back to my truck, I felt lighter than I had since before Anita got sick. The words were locked away now, safe. They'd wait patiently for the day my whole family sat in one room, expecting something else entirely. 3 weeks after I signed, my oldest came alone. He never came alone. He came with an angle and an audience. So when I saw his truck in the driveway on a Tuesday afternoon, I knew something had gone sideways. He sat at my kitchen table and looked older than 39. "Dad, I'm in real trouble," he said. "The commercial deal fell through and the bank's calling the line of credit. I need collateral behind it." "What kind of collateral?" He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. "If I could put the property up as security, just temporarily, it's just paper, nothing changes for you." "The property, Anita's flower beds, the pond." "No," I said quietly, but it was no. His face changed. The softness left it entirely. "After everything," he said, "you're choosing the house over your own son. I'm choosing not to hand your creditors the deed to my home if your deal doesn't close." He stood up so fast the chair scraped the floor. "You know what this is? It's him. He's had 2 years to work on you, and you can't even see it. Sit down." He didn't. He grabbed his jacket. He told me I'd regret it, and he left his coffee untouched, and I listened to his truck on the gravel until there was nothing left to hear. I sat there a long time. I felt no satisfaction, only the specific sadness of saying the right thing to someone who isn't ready to hear it. Turning away your son costs something. even when he's reaching for the wrong lifeline. I didn't know yet how far he'd push. My daughter made her move in February. She arrived with her husband on a Saturday, unannounced. My youngest was there, replacing the washers on the kitchen taps, hands wet, a tea towel over his shoulder. She didn't waste time. "We need to talk about what's going on here." "I'm fixing the taps," my youngest said. "I mean in general. You're here constantly. Dad isn't. He's not in a position to be thinking clearly about all of this. And you're." She searched for the word carefully, positioning yourself. My youngest straightened up. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I drove him to Kingston 16 times last winter when his heart was giving him trouble. I drove Mum to her last 3 rounds of chemo because neither of you could clear your schedule." "So?" "That's not fair," my daughter-in-law said. "I'm not trying to be fair," my youngest said. "I'm trying to be accurate." That was when I spoke. That's enough. 3 words, quiet, and the room turned. My daughter looked at me, recalibrated, pressed her lips together. "Dad, we're trying to protect you." I said, "That's enough." She gathered her coat. At the door, she looked back at my youngest with something that might have been pity but wasn't. "You've got him fooled," she said, "but not us." The door closed harder than necessary. My youngest sat down on the kitchen floor and let out a long breath. I put my hand on his shoulder and said nothing, because I knew that 3 words weren't going to fix this. Words were cheap in this family. I was going to need something that couldn't be argued with. The guardianship research started in March. A friend mentioned carefully that my daughter had been making inquiries about the process for having an elderly parent declared mentally incapable in Ontario, about what documentation would support such a filing. She was building a paper trail, a case to argue later that I hadn't been of sound mind when I changed my will. My youngest told me this sitting on the edge of my bed, voice steady, hands not. I let it sit with me for a while. My own daughter, gathering evidence that her father was a confused old man, so she could stand somewhere down the road and argue his choices hadn't been real. I should have been gutted. Instead, I felt something close to calm. Because 6 months earlier, Bellamy had asked me a question that had seemed procedural at the time. Would I be willing to see my physician and have him document my cognitive status, dated the same day I signed? I'd said yes, without fully understanding why it mattered. I understood now. There was a signed letter from Dr. Fenelon at the Perth Medical Center, filed with my will, confirming that on the day I executed the new document, I was fully oriented, competent, and entirely capable of making decisions regarding my estate. Dated, witnessed, airtight. They were building a case to prove I was a fool. They didn't know I'd already proved I wasn't. And then my oldest got creative. He and his wife showed up together in April, all smiles, a box of Timbits on the counter, like a peace offering. "We've been thinking," his wife said, "about the tax situation. If you transferred the property to us now, while you're living, the estate savings would be significant down the road." I understood the play immediately. Transfer the house now, while I was alive, and there'd be nothing left to leave to my youngest later. Old me would have argued. New me was curious about how far they'd go. "Tell me more," I said. My oldest brightened and slid a transfer document across the table. A simple title transfer, he called it. His wife talked about protecting the family, keeping things streamlined, avoiding unnecessary complications down the road. Unnecessary complications. She meant my youngest. I picked up the papers. I made a show of reading them, nodding slowly at the right places. "This is a lot to think about," I said. "Take your time," my oldest said, though his knee was bouncing under the table. "I'll consider it," I told them, their faces lifted. They thought they had me. I let them believe that. I wanted to see the whole picture clearly, and they were showing it to me, page by page. They stayed for coffee, talking about things that weren't theirs yet, as though they already were. When they left, his wife hugged me and said, "We just love you, Randall." I watched their taillights disappear down the lane. Then I went to my workshop, opened the wood stove, and fed their transfer papers to the fire, 1 page at a time. I watched the edges curl and blacken. They'd shown me everything I needed to see. There was nothing left to wonder about. My heart got worse through that spring. I'd known it was coming. My father had gone the same way, and the cardiologist my youngest drove me to had been tracking it for 2 years. The stairs got harder. Some nights I'd sit on the edge of the bed in the dark, breathing slow, waiting for the tightness to pass. I told my youngest, He moved some things into the spare room without making it a moment, without a speech or a decision. He just started being there in the mornings, tracking my medications better than I tracked them myself, learning which symptoms were normal and which required a call to the clinic. The others didn't come. My oldest didn't call at all. My daughter called once, distracted, already gone mentally before she said goodbye. Word of the heart trouble reached them both and changed nothing visible. I made one more trip to Bellamy's office while I still felt strong enough to drive. If anything happens, I told him, you know what to do. Everything's in order, Randall, he said. You don't need to worry about any of it. I didn't tell my youngest. Not about the will, not about the letter, not about what was waiting for him in a locked filing cabinet on Gore Street. Part of me wanted him to know he'd be taken care of. But I knew what it would cost him. The knowledge would change how he moved through those last months, and I didn't want that. I wanted him to love me for free, the way he always had, for no reason except that it was who he was. So I said nothing, and I hoped I'd live long enough to see his face the day the truth came out. It happened on a quiet Thursday in November. He'd made Anita's roast chicken that evening, gotten the timing right for once, and we'd sat at the pine table, and I'd told him stories about her. The good ones, the ones from before she got sick, the ones that made him laugh. After dinner, I moved to the armchair by the window and watched the snow come down over the back field. The pond would be starting to freeze at the edges by now. He brought me tea and tucked the old wool throw across my knees without comment. Thank you for staying, I told him. He looked up from his book. Where else would I be? I closed my eyes. The house was warm. Outside, the snow was coming down soft and steady over 30 years of our life. I thought about Anita. I thought I could almost hear her in the next room. The tightness came slowly, then all at once. I didn't fight it. Everything was in order. The words were written and sealed and waiting. My youngest hand found mine. Dad, he said. I wasn't afraid. I had spent the last 2 years being quietly managed, quietly dismissed, quietly underestimated. And through all of it, one person had simply been there. Not for the house, not for what came after. Just there, the way you're supposed to be for someone you love. He deserved to know I'd seen it, all of it. Across town, in a locked filing cabinet in a lawyer's office on Gore Street, my last word was waiting for its moment. They buried me on a cold morning, and 3 days later my family sat in Gerald Bellamy's office. I'd imagined it enough times that the scene is clear to me. My oldest came in a dark suit with the air of a man who'd already decided how he was spending the afternoon. His wife beside him, composed, scanning the room. My daughter arrived with a folder tucked under her arm, her guardianship research neatly organized and ready to deploy. They took chairs near the front, the good chairs, the ones closest to the desk. My youngest came in last. He was wearing his work jacket, the fleece-lined one he'd had for years, and he took a seat near the door, out of the way, like a man who wasn't sure he was supposed to be there. He told a friend afterward that he'd come because it felt wrong not to. Anita's sister was there, down from Thunder Bay. The Carruthers from next door, my 2 witnesses, a few others. Bellamy sat behind his desk with a sealed envelope and a thick folder squared in front of him. The clock on the wall ticked. My oldest leaned toward my daughter and said, "Not quietly enough. Let's get this done. I've got a showing at 4. My daughter smirked. His wife was already on her phone. Bellamy cleared his throat. He read in a steady, unhurried voice. He began with the smaller bequests, charitable donations, a few personal items. Then, to my son and to my daughter, I leave the sum of $5,000 each, and a letter I have asked to be read aloud today. My oldest let out a short laugh, a relieved sound. He thought it was the preamble, the appetizer. And the residuary estate, Bellamy continued. The property, all registered accounts, and the entirety of my remaining assets. My oldest and my daughter leaned forward together. Bellamy looked up once, then back at the page. I leave in full to my youngest son. For one long second, nothing moved. Then my oldest laughed again, confused. A different sound entirely, higher. Sorry, could you read that again? Bellamy did, same words, same steady voice. The laugh died in my oldest son's throat, like something shutting off at the source. My daughter's face did something I wish I could have seen in person. The smirk didn't just fade, it fell off all at once, like a picture sliding off a wall. Her folder sat in her lap, suddenly useless. At the back of the room, my youngest had gone completely still. His hand had come up slowly over his mouth. His eyes were wet and wide and lost. "That can't be right," my daughter said finally. Her voice was thin. "It is right," Bellamy said, without inflection. "It is properly executed, witnessed, and filed with the court." Then he reached for the sealed envelope. He broke the seal and unfolded my letter. He read it exactly as I'd written it, plain handwriting, the words I'd spent 4 nights choosing carefully. "To my children, if you're hearing this, I'm gone. And you've just learned how I chose to divide what Anita and I spent 30 years building. I know some of you are angry. So let me explain calmly, the way I could never quite manage while I was alive. When your mother was dying, one of you drove her to the hospital. The other 2 sent boxes in the mail. When my Evastra was failing, one of you came up in the cold and fixed it. The other one promised to send someone. When my heart started giving out, one of you learned my medication schedule. The others didn't call. I loved all 3 of you. I still do, but love and inheritance are not the same thing. A person who only shows up when there's something to show up for hasn't really shown up at all. Your brother showed up every time. For your mother, for me, for nothing, because there was nothing to gain and he came anyway. That is worth something. In this case, it is worth everything. I don't ask you to forgive me. I ask you to be kinder to him than you were. He's earned it many times over, and he would never say so himself." Bellamy lowered the page. My oldest was on his feet. His face was pale and tight. He wasn't thinking clearly. He was sick. Someone got in his ear. Bellamy opened the folder without hurrying. He laid 2 documents side by side and turned them to face the room. "This," he said, tapping the first, "is a letter from Dr. Fenelon at Perth Medical, dated the same day your father signed this will. It confirms in clinical terms that he was fully competent, fully oriented, and entirely capable of making estate decisions." He tapped the second, and this is the will itself, witnessed by 2 individuals with no financial interest in the estate, Mr. and Mrs. Carruthers, who are present today. The Carruthers nodded quietly from their chairs by the window. "Your father planned this over many months," Bellamy said. "He anticipated this moment, and he closed every door he could see. You're welcome to seek legal advice about contesting. I'll tell you now, as I would tell any client in this situation. You won't succeed, it will be a matter of public record, and it will cost you considerably more than $5,000. My oldest sat down slowly. For the first time in his adult life, he had nothing to say. My daughter's folder sat unopened on her lap. All that careful research, all those phone calls, nowhere left to go with any of it. At the back of the room, my youngest finally lowered his hands from his face. He looked, I'm told, like a man who had been standing in the dark for a very long time, and someone had finally turned on a light. The fallout settled the way it always does, fast once the ground gives way. My oldest had been counting on the property to secure financing for a commercial development he'd been building toward for 2 years. Without it, the deal collapsed and the line of credit came due. He'd built his next chapter on a foundation that wasn't his. The weight of it landed all at once. My daughter found a lawyer and asked him to review everything. The conversation was short. The competency letter was airtight. The witness record was clean. There were no grounds. She let it go. My youngest kept the house. He could have sold it. 800,000, maybe more. Enough to change his life completely, to buy something smaller somewhere easier, to start over. He didn't. He moved into the red brick just outside of Perth and kept it much as it always was. My tools stayed in the workshop. Anita's perennials came up in the spring the way they always had. The pine table stayed where it was. He did one new thing. He cleared a section of the south field, the flat part near the pond, and built a handful of raised garden beds. He put in a small tool shed, left it unlocked, and posted a hand-painted sign at the gate inviting neighbors to come use the space. He organized a planting day in May with some families from Grenville Elementary. He named the garden after his mother. He also set up registered education savings plans for his brother's 2 children, my grandchildren, who'd had nothing to do with any of this and everything to look forward to. He called his brother to tell him. His brother, I'm told, said nothing for a long time, and then said, thank you in a voice that didn't sound like his usual voice at all. They were quiet with each other for a long while after that, but the door was still open. Word travels in a small town, same as it always has. Families who'd known us for years, who'd witnessed the years of quiet mockery without saying much, started telling a different story. Anita's sister, who'd sat in the corner at enough of those family dinners to understand what she'd watched, came to the house one afternoon with a pie and something she needed to say. "We were wrong about him," she told my youngest at the door. "All of us. Your father saw something the rest of us were too comfortable to bother seeing." At the next family gathering, a cousin's wedding that August, it was my youngest who sat at the center of things. Not because he demanded it, because everyone finally understood that the man they'd written off as the family disappointment had been, all along, the only one who understood what a family actually was. Someone asked him at that wedding how it felt to have inherited everything. He thought about it for a moment, then he said, "I didn't inherit things. I inherited proof. Proof that he saw me." He paused. "That's worth more than the house. I would have been proud enough to burst if I'd been there. In a way I was. Here's what I learned at the end of a long life, watching my own children show me exactly who they were. I stayed quiet for 18 months, not because I'd lost my grip, and not because I was easy to steer, and not because grief had made me soft. I stayed quiet because I was listening, because I'd learned, later than I should have, that the truth doesn't need you to argue for it. It just needs you to give it room to breathe. Given enough time, it speaks for itself." My oldest and my daughter mistook my silence for surrender. They thought a man who stopped fighting was a man who'd given up. They were wrong. A man who stops fighting might just be a man who's already decided. I didn't punish my children. I want that said plainly. I gave them what a father owes his children, and I gave the rest to the one who'd earned it the slow way, on ordinary Wednesdays, in hospital waiting rooms, on a cold ladder in November, with no audience and nothing to gain. Family isn't the people who show up at the will reading. It's the person who showed up for the 30 years before it. The one in the waiting room chair, the one on the roof in the snow, the one who says "I'm here for you" and means it every single time. My youngest was that person. He always had been. He just never made a point of saying so, because that's not who he is. I made sure that one day, in a quiet room full of people who'd underestimated him, everyone else would finally know it too. If you've ever been the quiet one, the one who did the work no one noticed, the one who got passed over while the louder voices filled all the space, hear me. Keep showing up. Keep being exactly who you are. The truth always finds its way to the surface eventually. In my house it always did.